Hi guys and Happy New Year! May it be a better one. It is high time for my favorite books of 2019. This is one of the videos that I enjoy most watching on other people's channels because it gives you such a good idea of a booktuber's tastes and preferences. And I think it might become one of my favorite videos to film as well, because with this kind of video there is little to no chance that I'm going to drag somebody's favorite book into the dirt, which in other videos is almost always a chance with me. I have made a list of 12 favorite books, which is still my top 10, because I read roughly 120 books last year, so this is my top 10%. If you were to cross-reference this list with my Goodreads, you might notice that there are a few books on this list here, to which I have given only 4 stars on Goodreads, so the second highest rating. While at the same time there are a few books on Goodreads which I have given 5 stars, which don't appear on this list. The reason for that discrepancy is that I sometimes give a book a high rating even though I didn't enjoy it extremely much and it didn't blow my mind. But I acknowledge what a well-crafted, well-written book it is, and my lack of enjoyment wasn't necessarily the book's fault. For instance, I read The Underground Railroad in 2019 and I thought it was an extremely well-written book, and it did touch me emotionally too. I cried, which is, well, it happens more and more often, but certainly not with every book. But it didn't really blow my mind because it was about a subject which I feel familiar with. So it didn't leave a deep and lasting impression, which is why I didn't include it in this video. But I still think it is an extremely good book, so I gave it 5 stars on Goodreads, but didn't include it here. And something else that I'd like to say by way of preface is that while there is definitely a progression on this list from great to greater, the exact order isn't fixed, especially in the lower ranks. I'm just too bad at picking favorites. So my first item on this list is the only book on this list which wasn't written for an adult audience, and that is The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. This is an absolutely wonderful children's book about the power of stories, both on a personal psychological level, about the importance of understanding one's story and one's past in order to be able to see which forces are at work psychologically that dictate the way we act in the present. And it is also about the power of stories on a broader political level. It is about how whosoever controls the past also controls the present reality. It is the story of a witch who lives in a forest with a tiny dragon and a philosophically minded swamp monster who adopts a girl child that was sacrificed to her and accidentally feeds her moonlight, which magics her, puts magic into the child, which makes her a witch as well. And of course, in due time, this girl child is going to shake the foundations of the city-state that sacrificed her to the supposedly evil witch. The second item I read in ebook format, The Glorious Heresies by Lisa McInerney. This is set in Cork in contemporary Ireland, and it is about how people in precarious circumstances can lose their way and adopt a criminal lifestyle. Not just because the system has failed them, but because the system is rigged against them in the first place. It is also the story or stories of how victims become perpetrators themselves, and it is about how atrociously Ireland has treated its women for decades. It is, however, also a very funny book because it is written in such a snarky and sarcastic tone, and not in a way that it makes fun of poor people, but on the contrary, by being somewhat incongruously lighthearted here and there, it humanizes these people and makes the reader feel like they are not reading about complete monsters. And it is a really, really good book, and one that inspires a lot of compassion, I think. Item number 3 is The Western Wind by Samantha Harvey. This is just an extremely well-crafted murder mystery / character study. It is set in a small English village at the end of the 15th century, where the village's priest is tasked with finding a murderer of a well-respected member of the community. The unusual thing about this book is that it is told backwards, so it opens on day 5 of the murder investigation, and each successive part of the book is then the day that came before. So it is told Memento style, and as in Memento, not only the story but also the characters of the people involved are slowly revealed, and at the end, of course, heartbreak awaits. Speaking of heartbreak, the next item on my list is Tin Man by Sarah Winman. You will have heard of this one before. This is just an extremely heartbreaking story about isolation, and isolation that people bring on themselves unnecessarily, and how they sometimes hurt other people in the process. If you've been in two minds about whether or not you should pick this up, I think that you should give it a try. I can't imagine that this book can be completely wrong for any one person. Not so very different in subject matter, and in fact probably an inspiration for Tin Man, is Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin. This is quite a gut-wrenching story about a homosexual man in the 1950s who cannot come to terms with his sexuality and isn't ready to embrace the reality of it, and thereby destroys other people in his way. He's a very unsympathetic character, but this is still an absolutely devastating short story. Next up is Everything Under by Daisy Johnson. This is one of the many retellings of Greek myth that have been published lately, but it is one of those that have been transposed into a modern setting. And I think, to be honest, that this is the only kind that really deserves the name retelling. I think in order for it to be a real retelling, something has to be transposed into a different time and place. But anyway, this was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2018, and if it had won, Daisy Johnson would have been the youngest person to win the prize ever. And it would have been deserved, because it is really a very well-crafted book. I'm sure that the winning book, Milkman by Anna Burns, is also a very deserved winner, because it does seem to be the more hard-hitting book. Next I have a poetry collection, poems by Sylvia Plath, chosen by Carol and Duffy. Until the end of last year, I had never read a poem by Sylvia Plath. Not having grown up in an English-speaking country, I didn't read her in school, and it somehow never occurred to me to seek out her poetry online. But then at the end of last year I did. I read one poem and immediately went and bought this whole collection, and I found many poems in this collection that I found equally as impressive as the first poem that I read. Funnily enough, though, the first poem that I read is still my favorite one after I read this whole collection. It is part of this collection as well. It is the poem Blackberrying. If you've read it, I'd like to know what you think of it, and if it is one of your favorites as well, or one of your least favorites perhaps. My next two books are both fantasy novellas published by Tor.com Publishing. The first is The Sorcerer of the Wildeeps by Ashante Wilson. I made a review video of just this book a while ago. It was the second video that I uploaded. I'll link it in the description box. This is about a caravan crossing a Sahara-like desert accompanied by a band of soldiers, which include two demigods. Now, the gods in this world, which looks suspiciously like our world, are actually just very technologically advanced humans, perhaps, who worked with genetic modification and also mastered the art of turning themselves non-corporeal, and then were able to travel at the speed of light and made off for another planet and left the humans and their children, the demigods, behind. What is most fascinating about this novella is the voice of the narrator, and how in telling the story he changes registers and mixes registers all the time, from the soldier slang in the taverns to the highly philosophical, and his mind often meanders and he changes from one register to the other seamlessly, and it makes for just such a wild linguistic ride to read this story. My second novella I don't have a hard copy of, unfortunately, not yet in any case. It was published only in September in time for Halloween season, because it is a horror story, I suppose. The Monster of Elendhaven by Jennifer Giesbrecht. It is set in a gloomy northern industrial seaside town which has been ravaged by environmental disaster, and there a man who cannot die and who has developed a taste for murder and a sorcerer team up for an epic revenge against all the people who have wronged them. If you read the blurb on Goodreads and some of the reviews, you get the impression that this is pure violence porn, but it could not be farther from it because of the way that it is written in such a stylized and lush and lyrical way. It is a bit like a Tim Burton film, but without the clownishness. It is also just such a wild ride, and I loved the overtones of social issues and critique of capitalism. I'll talk about it more in my upcoming December wrap-up, but I highly recommend that you check this out if you have the stomach for some gore. The third to last item on my list is actually, I think, my third favorite book of the year, and it is also one that I read only in December, but recency bias is definitely not at work here because it really is a good book. A Dead Man in Deptford by Anthony Burgess. This is a fictional reconstruction of the last couple of years in the life of Elizabethan poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe. I'll talk about it more in depth in my wrap-up, but the fascinating thing about this book is also the way it was written. It is written from the perspective of a theatre acquaintance of Marlowe's, and the author does his best to, well, not exactly recreate an Elizabethan writing style, because that is always, of course, a thing of speculation, but he does his best to invent something that the reader will perceive as halfway authentical Elizabethan writing style, and this makes this book just so extremely clever, and I'll talk more about the details in my December wrap-up. And my top 2 reads of the year will come as a surprise to exactly no one who has watched my channel in the past 6 months. A Brief History of 7 Killings by Marlon James and Black Leopard, Red Wolf by Marlon James. With both of these books, it is again the language that played the biggest part in making them my top 2 books of the year. You might notice a theme there. A Brief History of 7 Killings won the Man Booker Prize in 2015. It is the story of a handful of people, or 2 handfuls of people, who were in some way or another directly or indirectly connected to the attempted assassination of Bob Marley. They are all fictitious people, but some of them I hear are based on real people. So we have gang bosses in Kingston, but also the small criminals. There is a Rolling Stone reporter, and most prominently a woman who just had the bad luck of standing there and becoming witness to the attempted assassination. So what's so great about the way that the book is written is that all the characters speak directly to the reader in direct speech, and those of them that are Jamaicans, which are the majority, are using Jamaican patois to varying degrees. And this makes the book feel extremely authentic and realistic and alive, really. And it is largely the same with Black Leopard, Red Wolf. This is a fantasy book with an old premise, really. The main character and narrator is imprisoned and has to give his testimony about a fantasy quest that failed miserably. He and a band of reluctant collaborators were hired to find an abducted child, and they did find him, but he died in the end, which is not a spoiler because it's the first sentence of the book. And the protagonist now has to explain how it came about that his band failed so dramatically with this job. This is the first book in a trilogy, and books 2 and 3 are going to be the same story but told from the points of view of other characters in the group. This is inspired by the myth and folklore of sub-Saharan Africa, and in order to tell this story convincingly, Marlon James invented his very own language, not in the sense that Tolkien invented languages for his elves, but rather it is a matter of style in this book. Marlon James clearly didn't want to use the Queen's English to write an epic fantasy that is set practically in Africa. So he played around a lot and found ways to express things and to speak about things that sound more than a little alien to us and not quite English, which is of course very fitting for such a story. So this has definitely been a theme among my best of 2019 reads. Interesting ways in which authors used language in new and inventive ways, the better to talk about the subjects that they were talking about. From the poetry of Sylvia Plath, naturally, to Anthony Burgess's fake Elizabethan, to Marlon James's plays with patois. I'm sorry, I have lost the light again. I hope that this video is still watchable towards the end. May the next reading year be at least as good as this one. I will see you again very soon, probably with my December wrap-up in which I'm going to talk more about 2 of my best books of the year. Bye!